questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Prime Minister. Why has the IMF slashed Australia's economic growth forecast to just 1.7% this calendar year?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for his question. The revision by the IMF overnight reflects the uncertainty of the times in which we live, Mr Speaker. And that uncertainty extends to the global environment, of course, which I'd hope the Leader of the Opposition would be familiar with. I certainly am. I have been for some time. We've been fashioning budgets for years now, Mr Speaker, to deal with the increasing uncertainty there is in the global economic climate. He would also be familiar with the real impacts on the economy of the terrible drought that is now impacting on the Australian economy. And this is why, Mr Speaker, over successive budgets now, we have been putting in place the types of resilience measures that support our economy in times like this. And the uncertainty of the times reflected in what we've seen in the IMF forecast revisions overnight, which obviously just doesn't apply to Australia, they apply to a whole host of economies all around the world, Mr Speaker. That's just a fact. That's just a fact. But the truth remains that while things are tough, Australia's economy is growing only second to the United States of all G7 nations. Now, Mr Speaker,
on my left.
There's a lot of work to do, but the uncertain times, I tell you what it calls for. It calls for lower taxes, which is what we're doing, Mr Speaker. It calls for reducing the costs of doing business in this country by busting through regulations that hold back projects and simplifying procedures in the industrial relations area to ensure that people can get employed. It requires us, as we are doing, to engage in the reforms in our skills sector, to ensure that we're expanding our trade borders all around the world, as we've been doing now over the last 6 years. It calls for us to invest $100 billion in infrastructure, as we are doing, and that's just on transport infrastructure, with some almost $10 billion being invested just this year alone, Mr Speaker. And it calls on us to invest $200 billion out into the future on recapitalising our defence industries, as we heard yesterday, out at Quickstep in south-western Sydney. $250,000 worth of value added is provided by Quickstep, an Australian company, into every Joint Strike Fighter that will be flown by every country who purchases them around the world. They're the investment decisions that our government has taken to address these uncertain times, Mr Speaker. Those opposite think the answer is higher taxes, and they think higher taxes will have no impact on the economy. And the Leader of the Opposition was asked today whether he thought Labor's $387 billion in higher taxes would have had an impact on the economy. And he said no. He said, no, I don't think they would. I don't think they would. He said the answer was no, in response to specifically the tax increases they had proposed when it comes to the housing tax and things of that nature. So, Mr Speaker, we're for lower taxes, we're for a stronger economy and a strong budget.
The has concluded. The member for Rankin.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister just stated that the downgrades in the IMF release apply to everyone. Why is the IMF's downgrade for Australia's growth 4 times worse than for other advanced economies?
The Treasurer.
Mr Speaker, as you know—
Could the Treasurer just pause for a second? The member for McEwen will withdraw that term.
I'll withdraw then.
I just remind the member for McEwen, we've been through this with members being referred to by their correct titles, and both sides of the House agreed it had made a difference, and we're not going to slip back into that. The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The IMF today, in its global economic outlook, had Australia's economic growth in 2019 at 1.7% and in 2020 at 2.3%. And as the House knows, Australia is in its 29th consecutive year of economic growth, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, employment growth in Australia is at 2.5%. Do you know what it was when we came to government, when we inherited the fiscal mess from the Labor Party? 0.7%, Mr Speaker, less than a third of what we have inherited today. Mr Speaker, economic participation number of people who are in work is at a record high, at over 66%, Mr Speaker. The welfare dependency today is now at a 30-year low, Mr Speaker. We now have a balance.
The Treasurer will resume his seat. The member for Rankin on a point of order.
Thank you, Speaker. Relevance. The question was why was the IMF's downgrade for Australia 4 times worse than the other advanced economies?
The Treasurer has the call. I'm listening to the Treasurer. He's still very relevant.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As I said, the IMF had Australia's economic growth at 1.7% in 2019 and 2.3% in 2020, but the Australian economy continues to grow. And as the Prime Minister said, the Leader of the Opposition was asked today, would have his taxes hurt the Australian economy? And I remind the House that his retiree tax, $57 billion, his family business tax, $27 billion, and his taxes on superannuation, $34 billion.
Treasurer will resume his seat. Treasurer will resume his seat. This cannot, under the standing orders, be a point of order on relevance.
It's a bad one then, Mr Speaker.
Bad standing order? Well, you introduced it. Oh, sorry. The Leader of the Opposition can resume his seat. The Treasurer, I'm listening to the Treasurer. He does need to relate. He does need to. He might listen to me for a second. He does need to relate his material to the question.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The fact of the matter is the Australian economy continues to grow, and as the Prime Minister has indicated, the IMF's projections of Australia's growth is second only to the United States from G7 countries.
The member for the call needs to alternate. The member for Reid has the call.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister outline to the House why it is important for the Morrison government to maintain a strong budget discipline and deliver a balanced economic plan in the face of global uncertainty?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. A strong budget can never be taken for granted, and the economy that supports that strong budget can never be taken for granted, and it is a critical asset at a time of economic uncertainty that we see around the world today. You need the strong anchor of a strong budget to deal not only with the challenges of today, but to ensure that we have resilience for the challenges that will undoubtedly come in the years ahead as a result of the global economic outlook that we see. And as I remarked in response to the earlier question, the IMF's revisions overnight just demonstrate that global uncertainty, and it highlights again the need for policies that bring stability and certainty in our financial and economic management. Now is a time, Mr Speaker, for our economic and financial management, one that is about cool and clear heads. It is not a time for Labor's policies of panic and crisis when it comes to managing our fiscal environment in these times. We know what the consequences are of Labor's policies of reckless chaos and panic and crisis.
Members on my left.
Our government was re-elected on the basis of being
Member for Lyons is warned.
of being calm, of being stable, and in introducing certain policies that support growth in our economy. Our policies understand these are very important challenges that we're facing globally, and is backed by the strong fiscal discipline, which means we can invest in the policies that build that resilience, the tax cuts that we have delivered, the investments in infrastructure. But not only that, Mr Speaker, we are keeping the budget and bringing it back into balance this very year, while at the same time as delivering record spending on hospitals, on schools, on moving forward with disabilities, of addressing the challenges in aged care and mental health, Mr Speaker. And that strong economic support that comes from a budget that enable us to face today's challenges is also needed there for the future. And I know those opposite would engage again in Labor's panic spending to throw away the last 6 years if they'd had the opportunity at the last election, and plunge the nation back and remove the certainty that comes with the discipline that a coalition government always brings. Our policy is to maintain the discipline, to keep our heads, to be cool and calm in the face of the uncertainty that is now presented to Australians in their own budgets, the budgets of the nation, and for their own jobs. They can rely on us to keep our heads and remain calm and stable. Labor's policies are policies of panic and chaos.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is again addressed to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister admit that since May, the Reserve Bank has downgraded its growth forecast for Australia? The OECD has downgraded its growth forecast for Australia by twice as much as the G20. And the IMF has downgraded its growth forecast for Australia by 4 times more than other advanced economies. Why doesn't the government have a plan to turn the economy around?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Our plan is very clear, and we took it at the last election. It was endorsed by the Australian people, Mr Speaker, and that plan is anchored, first and foremost, not in the panicked and crisis policies of the Labor Party, which, if they had had the opportunity, had they won the last election, they would be now taking a wrecking ball to the Australian economy with their higher taxes and their reckless spending. No, the Australian people chose stability and certainty of keeping more of what they earn, of ensuring that those tax cuts would be delivered, and that's exactly what we delivered as soon as we got back into this place, and Labor resisted it and resisted it and resisted it, and then they folded as usual, Mr Speaker. They can't even keep their consistency in their opposition, Mr Speaker, to good economic policy. Now, Mr Speaker, on top of that, we've invested in the infrastructure and continue to invest in the infrastructure. We are investing in programs to cut the costs of doing business in this country by reducing the regulatory burden, whether it's on getting projects up and running or making sure we can employ more people in small businesses and medium-sized businesses all around the country. We're investing in expanding our trade borders. We're investing in developing new industries. And we are investing, Mr Speaker, in ensuring that we're capturing the opportunity of rebuilding the capability of our defence forces, which under those opposite, when they were faced with economic crisis, plundered the national security of our nation, taking defence spending to its lowest level since prior to the Second World War. So not only have we rebuilt the nation's finances, we are rebuilding the nation's defence capability. We are rebuilding the confidence of Australians, Mr Speaker, because more Australians are in work today than at any other time as a proportion of our population in Australia's history. So, Mr Speaker, they voted for an economic plan that they know can prevail in the face of economic adversity, and they rejected the higher taxes and the reckless higher spending and the reckless targets and job emergency it would create policies of the Labor Party on emissions reduction, and they chose a coalition that knows how to manage our economy and our nation's finances.
Just before I call the Leader of the Opposition, has the Prime Minister concluded his answer? He has. Okay. The member for Bass.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on why it is important for the Morrison government to implement its plan to keep Australians safe and secure in an increasingly uncertain global environment?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Bass for her question. She knows, like I would hope all members of this House would know, and I certainly know the government members know, that there is no greater responsibility for the Commonwealth than keeping Australians safe and secure. And those challenges today are significant, and they're great in a time of great uncertainty globally and also within our region. And that's why our government continues to take disciplined action, responsible action, careful action, measured and targeted action to ensure that we are doing everything we can to protect Australians and to protect the national interest of Australians. And we know the first of those is ensure that you need a strong budget to be able to support the investment in these key capabilities, but also, Mr Speaker, to focus our efforts on strong and disciplined economic management to support that budget. And I have already outlined to the House the plan that the Australian people backed at the last election and that we are now implementing. And you need to invest in the capability. And we next year, Mr Speaker, will have brought defence spending to 2% of GDP, taking it back from the record lows under the Labor Party when they were in office, which fell to the lowest level since prior to the Second World War in 1938. And when I was in the United States, Mr Speaker, it was a matter of great pride that I could say that the Australian people, the Australian Commonwealth, was carrying its weight when it comes to our national defence with our 2% commitment that we'll be achieving when so many others don't, because in our great alliance with the United States we carry our weight. And under this government, Mr Speaker, we've ensured we're carrying our weight again by increasing our defence spending as a share of our economy to 2%. But it's not just that. Restoring investments in our border agencies, in our intelligence capabilities, in our law enforcement, that we're carefully nurturing and developing the strategic relationships in our region, whether it is with China or the United States, Indonesia, and for the first time we've had a ministerial-level meeting of the Quad between India, Japan, the United States and Australia. The Quad, which provides stability and balance in our region that when Labor was in office they rejected and they abandoned, Mr Speaker. And we, as always, will introduce the laws which protect our kids. They protect our nation from those who have come and committed offences under our laws, and we have exported those criminals out of this country under the policies of this government, while when those were in office they let them stay here, Mr Speaker, and live in our community when they should not have. Bikies and others and criminal gang members who stayed in Australia. But most of all, we have the will to protect Australia, Mr Speaker. We are not undecided or divided on this side on national security measures, and that's why Australians can rely.
Just before I call the member for Rankin, I'd just like to inform the House that we have present in the gallery, Speaker's Gallery this afternoon, up there in the front row, a delegation of former members. On behalf of the House, we extend a very warm welcome to all of you. The member for Rankin.
Thank you very much, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Why does the Treasurer pretend that global factors are the primary reason for our floundering economy when the Reserve Bank, Deloitte Access Economics and others say Australia's weak economic growth is homegrown?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, there's no doubt we face some domestic challenges to our economy, not least of which is the #1 call on the budget, which is the drought, Mr Speaker, and the terrible drought that I saw firsthand when I was with the member for Maranoa in Inverell, in Warwick and with Stanthorpe, and which itself has taken at least 1/4 percentage point straight off GDP, as well as requiring a significant call on budget to provide income support and infrastructure support and the like. But, Mr Speaker, the member for Rankin will look for every single opportunity to talk down the Australian economy, Mr Speaker. Every single opportunity to put at risk Australian jobs, Mr Speaker. The member for Rankin, just a matter of 5 months ago, was the co-author, the co-architect with the member for McMahon in $387 billion of higher taxes. And when the Leader of the Opposition went on Sky TV today and was asked would his tax impost on the Australian people have an impact on the economy, he said no. He said no. But the reality is, from the 1st of July this year, Labor's retirees tax, Labor's superannuation tax, Labor's tax on family businesses would have all taken an effect. So, Mr Speaker, could you imagine dealing with these global economic challenges, which the IMF today has said is a synchronised slowdown in the global economy, and the impact of drought, which is hurting not only communities but, of course, hurting the budget? Could you imagine slugging retirees, homeowners, renters, people with money in superannuation with Labor's higher taxes? Don't look at what Labor says, look what Labor does, and they can't manage the public's money.
The member for Melbourne has the call.
My question is to the Prime Minister. The Bureau of Meteorology has said that the Murray-Darling Basin is in record drought and that the climate crisis is a significant factor. But your government is lifting pollution, which is making global warming worse and threatening farmers and communities on the land even further. Prime Minister, if we've always been a land of droughts and flooding rains, why are you doing everything in your power to make these extreme events worse? Doesn't every tonne of thermal coal that you export and burn send another farmer to the wall? Prime Minister, what is more important,
on my right.
crops or coal?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. And I would refer him to the speech I gave to the United Nations recently in the National Statement for Australia, which set out very clearly the actions that Australia was taking and our record, in particular in relation to renewable energy investments, which per capita today is the highest of any country in the world today. Now, I note the member for Melbourne shakes his head, Mr Speaker. I simply said that Australia's per capita investment in renewable energy is the highest in the world today, and he shook his head. Now, Mr Speaker, if he's in denial of those facts, I'll leave that to him. But, Mr Speaker, what I know is what I set out in that national statement, United Nations, which showed very clearly that we will meet our Kyoto 2020 targets, and not only will we meet them, we'll beat them by 367 million tonnes. And not only that, we will meet our 2030 commitments through the combination of measures that we've announced and the other factors that will contribute to that out to 2030. And we agree that there is a need to take action on climate change. That was not an issue of debate or division, I believe, between the major parties at the last election. The issue that was at debate, the issue that was being contested, was the scale and the level of targets that could be responsibly set for Australia into the future and the impact that that would have on the Australian economy. Now, at the election we were able to explain very clearly what the costs of those were, of our targets, and how we were going to meet them. Now, the Labor Party at the last election were unable to do that, and they were unable to spell out what the cost would be to jobs, and this was a key issue, Mr Speaker. And I note now that the Labor Party after the election cannot even settle a policy on climate change today. They cannot settle what their policy is. We've got 28% over here. We've got 45% over here.
Will resume his seat. Prime Minister needs to resume his seat. The member for Melbourne on a point of order.
On relevance, on two matters. One is, my question was about the government, not about others. Second, to be relevant, surely the Prime Minister must address the drought and the climate crisis at some point in the answer.
Just before I call the Prime Minister, there is a narrower scope in the question with respect to alternative policies, but in terms of what was in the question, there was 45 seconds worth there, and there were a number of questions, a number of statements, and when, as I've said before, I mean, I can't assist people with questions, but the longer they are, the more scope there is for the answerer to deal with the material. So the Prime Minister.
And now I note that the Labor Party, and I'm sure the Greens would agree because you joined together on this matter yesterday, was talking about what you describe as the climate emergency. Now I note that in response to a climate emergency, the Leader of the Opposition is going to say that we will know Labor's response sometime between October 2021 and March 2022, Mr Speaker. He says, and it was in a doorstop interview today, obviously the first chance that we have to be elected office will be after the next election, and so sometime between October 21 and March 2022 is when I expect it to be. That's the window. So that at that point in time, it will be worse than if the government doesn't actually have an. He talks about that. So they will develop a comprehensive policy at that time. Now, Mr Speaker, I would like to know what their policy is. If it's such an emergency as they say, then they should be able to say what the policy is.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. I'll just hear from the Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition used a clearly unparliamentary term, loudly, directly, heard by everyone.
Can I be blunt? I think I warned of this yesterday. I know it's a different term, but you know it's called an escalation. I'm going to ask the Leader of the Opposition if he will
Mr. Speaker, for the dignity of the House, I will certainly withdraw. But the Prime Minister was deliberately telling a mistruth. I was stating the date of the election.
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. I'll just finish. Yeah. Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. If the Leader of the Opposition believes he's been misrepresented, he has an opportunity after question time under the standing orders to take that matter up with the House. The Prime Minister's concluded his answer. No, there's nothing left on the clock. The member for Cowper.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister outline to the House why it is important that the Morrison-McCormack government continues to deliver its $100 billion infrastructure investment pipeline, and will the Deputy Prime Minister outline to the House the consequences of not building this critical infrastructure?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Cowper for his question. Mr Speaker, he understands the immense benefits that our $100 billion pipeline of investment over the next decade on infrastructure is going to have for the people of Cowper, indeed the people right across this nation. The age of infrastructure has well and truly arrived. The member for Cowper knows that the Coffs Harbour bypass, which he very staunchly advocated for with Gurmish Singh, the state member for Coffs Harbour, it's going to get people to where they need to be sooner and safer. It's going to transform the way people travel around the north coast of New South Wales and how freight travels, indeed, between Sydney and Brisbane. The government is transforming the transportation routes all over the country to achieve long-term objectives. However, these projects are not just about travel and delivery. They're also about jobs. They're about industries. They're about improving access to locations. Mr Speaker, we've heard from the Prime Minister in question time today about small business, and indeed our infrastructure pipeline of investment is going to help many small businesses right across the nation. We've talked today about trade. We know that 1 in 5 Australians rely on trade to have their job, Mr Speaker, and making sure that we've got the inland rail, making sure that we've got better access roads through the roads of strategic importance, through other road funding measures, Mr Speaker, is going to improve getting product from farms to ports and therefore to our markets. And of course it supports jobs. Our program supports jobs. Indeed, the Bruce Highway Upgrade program will invest $10 billion in the 1,652-kilometre stretch, that wonderful road between Brisbane and Cairns. Mr Speaker, 7,200 jobs throughout construction are being supported, are being engaged by this wonderful road project that we are investing in, Mr Speaker. Now, the consequence, I'm asked about the consequence of not having this sort of investment. Well, it's about jobs. It's about jobs. Investments made through the 2019-20 budget, that wonderful blueprint and vision brought down right at this spot on April 2 by the Treasurer. Mr Speaker, it's supporting more than 50,000 direct and indirect jobs. 50,000 jobs. The Inland Rail project stimulating local economies. As of August this year, there's been more than $33 million in contracts committed to more than 70 local businesses. And not just businesses directly providing ballast and other things for the Inland Rail, but owner of Andrews Auto Electrics in Parkes, Wayne Osborne, said even though there's been a downturn because of the drought in the rural sector, we've never been busier. We've put on 2 new apprentices in the last few months, as well as some more admin support. So that's how our $100 billion investment is helping rural and regional Australia, and indeed right across this great nation.
The Deputy Prime Minister's time has concluded. The member for Rankin has the call.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Treasurer. The Treasurer a moment ago said that drought funding was the #1 call on the budget. That's not true, is it?
The Treasurer has the call.
It is true. Mr Speaker, it is true. Thank you.
Members on my left. Members on my left. Members on my left. The member for Rankin is warned. The member for Barton. Member for Barton is warned. The member for Fairfax has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question goes to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer explain why lower taxes are important to growing a stronger economy? And Treasurer, what are the consequences of any higher taxing policy alternatives?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Fairfax for his question, and he brings to this place experience in small business, experience that is absolutely missing from those opposite, Mr Speaker. And the fact that in his electorate more than 20,000 small businesses will be able to access the extended instant asset write-off which was announced in this budget, and that more than 63,000 taxpayers in his electorate will be getting tax relief as a result of our announcements and our tax package, Mr Speaker, and around 25,000 of them will get the full $1,080, Mr Speaker, and the income tax offset. Now, Mr Speaker, our economy, with 5.3% unemployment, with a record number of people in work and workforce participation at a record high, with inflation at 1.6%, with a trade surplus, with their balanced budget, is, by those objective indicators, a good economy. Now, Mr Speaker, whose words are those, Mr Speaker? They are the words of Australia's longest-serving and most successful Treasurer and the architect of 10 budget surpluses, Peter Costello, Mr Speaker. That is what he said today about the Australian economy. And part of our economic plan is tax cuts, Mr Speaker. Tax cuts that have been legislated through this parliament, which will abolish a whole tax bracket, the 37 cents in the dollar tax bracket, and create one big tax bracket between $45,000 and $200,000, and will see 90%, more than 90% of Australian taxpayers pay a marginal rate of no more than 30 cents in the dollar. Now, Mr Speaker, there was a clear contrast in tax policies that were put to the Australian people at the last election. We supported lower taxes, and we're delivering lower taxes. The Labor Party took to the last election $387 billion of higher taxes, which are still on their books, Mr Speaker. And if Labor had got into government from the 1st of July this year, retirees, Mr Speaker, would have been hit with Labor's retirees tax, Mr Speaker. People with a superannuation would have been hit by Labor's superannuation tax, Mr Speaker, and family businesses would have been hit with Labor's family business tax, Mr Speaker. The reality is the Labor Party will always be the party of higher taxes chasing higher spending. The Coalition will always be the party of lower taxes and a stronger economy.
The member for Rankin.
Thanks very much, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. When global factors help our economy, the Prime Minister takes credit. But when global factors hinder our economy, the Prime Minister says it's not his fault. Why won't the Prime Minister be honest about the floundering economy and admit he doesn't have a plan to deal with it?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And from Wayne Swan's prodigy, Mr Speaker, they are rich words indeed, Mr Speaker. The Australian government and this government, when we see the global conditions that face the economy, I tell you what we do. What we don't do is what the former Treasurer did, Mr Swan, for whom the member previously worked, was we would not go out there and assume those conditions to exist forever. Now, Mr Speaker, I'll ignore the interjections, Mr Speaker.
Members on my left. Members on my left. I'm just going to say to members on my left, I'm not going to ignore them. Member for Hunter seems to have forgotten yesterday.
Now, Mr Speaker, when Labor were budgeting and there were iron ore prices of $180, Mr Speaker, what they did in their budget is they assumed those good times on those resources prices would be there forever. And on the basis of that, a Treasurer under Labor came to this dispatch box and said the 4 years of surpluses I announced tonight. The difference between how Labor budgets and how Liberals budget is when times are good, We don't always assume they will be that way globally. We actually factor that in with conservative forecasts. So that is why, in the last 3 years, Mr Speaker, we have seen an improvement on the original budget outcome because of the conservative estimates that have been built into the budget, Mr Speaker. We have overachieved each and every year. And the reason we do that is we do not take the global environment for granted. And when, Mr Speaker, the global environment takes a downturn, then that equally has an impact. But in our budget, we had been taking that into account for many years that was a prospect. And that was the budget we took to the election, and that is the budget that is in surplus now. So, Mr Speaker, those opposite, when times are better, they think they'll go on forever. And you can never assume that things will go on well forever under a Labor Party, because they always know how to wreck the economy and wreck the budget with reckless spending and policies of panic and crisis. We will take a calm and stable and methodical and measured approach to the nation's finances to ensure we can deliver now the essential services they rely on, and we can be there to provide the resilience for those services in the future.
Just before I call the member for Hughes, I'd also like to inform the House we have present in the gallery this afternoon the Australian Political Exchange Council's 23rd delegation from the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. On behalf of the House, extend a very warm welcome to you. The member for Hughes.
My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer explain to the House why it is important to grow and support our hard-working small business sector? And what are the consequences of alternative policies that would make life harder for this important part of our economy?
The Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Hughes for his question and acknowledge his background as a small business person, particularly in the furniture sector and manufacturing, before he got to this place, Mr Speaker. Now, in his electorate of Hughes, more than 14,000 small businesses will be able to access the instant asset write-off, which was extended to businesses with a turnover of up to $50 million, Mr Speaker, opening a way for more than 20,000 small and medium-sized businesses to access that scheme, and they employ more than an extra 1 million people, Mr Speaker. Now, small businesses are the backbone of the Australian economy. There are more than 3 million small businesses employing more than 7 million people. And since coming to government, more than 230,000 additional small businesses have been created, Mr Speaker, and we're committed to creating another more than 250,000 small businesses. But in Labor's last year in office, Mr Speaker, 65,000 small businesses closed their doors, Mr Speaker. That is the contrast between this government, which creates jobs and small businesses, and the Labor Party, which has seen small businesses close. Now, the policies that we've put in place: lower taxes, bring the tax rate down to 25% for small and medium-sized businesses, extending the instant asset write-off, helping to create a $2 billion securitisation fund to increase access to finance, ensuring that small businesses get paid on time, Mr Speaker, and that is critically important, obviously, to their cash flow. Ensuring that the ABCC is a cop on the beat, so those small businesses that work in the construction sector are not hit, Mr Speaker. And of course, helping to create more than 80,000 new apprenticeships is critical for small businesses. But I'm asked, are there any alternative approaches? And we know that Labor's higher taxes were going to hit small businesses right across the economy. But, Mr Speaker, the member for Rankin complains that we look at his transcripts too often. Well, we know we must be doing the right thing, Mr Speaker. So we looked at his application for leadership, otherwise known as his Light on the Hill speech, Mr Speaker, and we looked at the Light on the Hill speech, and we looked to see how many times he mentioned small business. How many times do you think? Zero, Mr Speaker, zero. So then we look at his first major speech as the Shadow Treasurer, which was to the...
The Treasurer will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
On relevance, Mr
The
Speaker.
Leader
He
of the
wasn't
Opposition will
asked.
resume his seat. No, the microphone's off. Hang on, just hang on. I'm just going to say, on that point of order, the The Treasurer is in order. He was asked about alternative policies. The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. The reality is the member for Rankin, who's in the shadow Treasury position, is a great threat to small businesses across the economy. We have created small businesses. They closed their doors under Labor. If they ever got another chance, it would happen again.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Prime Minister. Australia's growth forecasts are being repeatedly slashed. Why can't the Prime Minister give a straight answer and admit this basic fact? Why does the Prime Minister have no plan to deal with the floundering economy he presides over?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, again, Mr Speaker, in earlier answers to questions, I have acknowledged the revisions in the forecasts. And, Mr Speaker, as we go into MyEFO, the forecasts will be considered at that time, as they are in the MyEFO and the budget on every single occasion. I know the Leader of the Opposition isn't terribly familiar with the processes of budgets, having never served in those portfolios when he was in government. But, Mr Speaker, I'm sure he's becoming familiar with them now in his new role. Now, Mr Speaker, I'm asked about the government's plan. And one of the things that occurred after the 18th of May this year was the huge sigh of relief of those whose jobs and whose investments and whose businesses depended on strong and capable financial and economic management. The sense of fear, Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Australian people about the Australian economy, if it were to have fallen into the hands of the Labor Party, was absolutely palpable. And so Australians were looking for a stable and secure plan, a plan that we had set out in the budget, a budget which for the first time coming back into surplus in 12 years, a budget surplus that has been established as a result of the hard work of Australians out there each and every day, of 1.4 million Australians coming into work, of having the lowest level of welfare dependency. This is what our plan is delivering, Mr Speaker.
Prime Minister resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Speaker, it goes to relevance. The question went to the growth forecast being repeatedly slashed.
The Leader of the Opposition the Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition is right. The question did go to that, but it also had a second question about what the government's plan was. The Prime Minister has the call. He's in order.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. So I'm happy to talk about the plan that was endorsed by the Australian people and that was set out in the budget, which was for lower taxes, allowing Australians to keep more of what they own, a plan that was opposed by the Labor Party at the last election, violently opposed by the Labor Party, and instead wanted to put forward $387 billion in higher taxes to impose on the Australian economy at the worst possible time, because the global circumstances that Australia faces today were of no mystery to the Australian government and the Liberal and Nationals parties, but they were obviously a complete mystery to the Labor Party, because they thought the best thing to do was apply $387 billion in higher taxes. The investments in infrastructure, the investments in skills, the expanding of our trade capabilities, Mr Speaker, the reduction in business regulation and making it easier to reduce regulation on how people can be employed. And when do we have to wait to hear what Labor's policies are? As I was referring into a previous question, the Leader of the Opposition has said that we will know about Labor's policies before the next election. So that's sometime between the end of 21 and March 22.
The member for Cooper.
That's what I was referring to.
Member for
so
Cooper
we won't
is
know
warned.
What their climate policy is, what their economic policies are, what their tax policies, but the Australian people know what our policies are, Mr Speaker, and they voted for them, and we will keep implementing them despite the opposition of Labor.
Has concluded. The member for Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Population, Cities and Urban Infrastructure. Will the minister outline to the House why it is important to have a balanced and disciplined economic plan, and how this allows for investment in critical urban infrastructure projects? And is the minister aware of the consequences of alternative economic policies to this critical infrastructure?
The Minister for Population, Cities and Urban Infrastructure.
We're going to thank the member for Lindsay for her question.
Members on my left.
And for her outstanding advocacy of Western Sydney, and particularly her advocacy for more congestion-busting infrastructure in that fast-growing part of Australia. Mr Speaker, a balanced and disciplined economic plan is critical to being able to invest in vital infrastructure, because without a strong economy, you simply don't have the resources to build the infrastructure that our nation needs. And we've introduced, Mr Speaker, a $100 billion pipeline of infrastructure. This year alone, as members opposite even refuse to acknowledge, we're spending almost $10 billion on infrastructure around this country. And that is in fact more than double the amount that was spent in Labor's last year in office only 6 years ago. Mr Speaker, this means that hundreds of projects are under construction right now, right across this great country, including in our big capital cities. Things like the M1 up in Brisbane, WestConnex in Sydney, the Monash in Melbourne, the North-South Corridor in Adelaide, the Metronet over in Perth, or the Bridgewater Bridge, which will soon be under construction in Tasmania, Mr Speaker. This largest infrastructure pipeline in Australian history has been acknowledged even by respected organisations, by Macro Monitor, who say that as a result of our plan, we are now in the biggest ever transport boom in the history of Australia. And we can only do this, Mr Speaker, because we have a strong economy. Now, I'm asked, Mr Speaker, about alternatives. And, Mr Speaker, as you know, the Labor Party maintains their policy of $387 billion of new taxes on the economy. That's taxes on investments, that's taxes on small businesses, that's taxes on property, it's taxes on your savings. And all of this would be a wrecking ball on the overall economy. And if you have a wrecking ball in the economy, it means you have less money to be able to invest in infrastructure. Mr Speaker, we have a 10-year pipeline of infrastructure projects. But if the Labor Party got into government and wrecked the economy, which projects would they be putting in jeopardy because they wouldn't have the finances to be able to pay for it? Would indeed put in jeopardy the Great Western Sydney Airport project, which the member for Lindsay has so strongly supported? Would it put in jeopardy some of the other great projects, the Inland Rail project, other projects? Mr Speaker, the fact of the matter is, if you don't have the money because you can't manage the economy, then you can't build the infrastructure that we need.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I seek leave to move the following motion. That the House 1 notes that A, the International Monetary Fund has slashed its growth forecast for the Australian economy for this year by almost 20%. B, the downgrade to Australia's growth forecast by the IMF is 4 times worse than the downgrade to advanced economies.
I'll just say to the Leader of the House, the Leader of the Opposition is entitled to state his motion in full. The Leader of the Opposition.
C, the government has consistently ignored growing evidence that the Australian economy is floundering, including 1, the slowest economic growth in a decade, 2, the worst wages growth on record, 3, a record 1.9 million Australians being unemployed or underemployed, 4, a decline in GDP per capita last year with flat growth in the last quarter, 5, record levels of household debt, 6, consumer confidence at a 4-year low, 7, business confidence well below average, and 8, sluggish productivity growth. D, the International Monetary Fund has called on countries, including Australia, to provide fiscal support, saying, and I quote, "Monetary policy cannot be the only game in town and should be coupled with fiscal support where fiscal space is available." And E, the government has no plan to address Australia's floundering economy and continues to ignore calls from the Reserve Bank of Australia and the International Monetary Fund to provide fiscal support, including by investing in infrastructure, and 2, therefore calls on the Prime Minister to be straight with the Australian people about Australia's floundering economy and develop a plan to stimulate economic growth, including by bringing forward infrastructure investment across the nation, including in regional and rural Australia.
Is leave granted? Leave is not granted. Member for Rankin, leave is not granted.
So much of the standing and sessional orders be suspended, as would prevent the Leader of the Opposition from moving the following motion immediately. That the House, 1, notes that A, the International Monetary Fund has slashed its growth forecast for the Australian economy for this year by almost 20%. B, the downgrade has consistently ignored growing evidence. The downgrade to Australia's growth forecast by the IMF is 4 times worse than the downgrade to advanced economies. C, the government has consistently ignored growing evidence that the Australian economy is floundering, including 1, the slowest economic growth in a decade, 2, the worst wages growth on record, 3, a record 1.9 million Australians being unemployed or underemployed, 4, a decline in GDP per capita last year with flat growth in the last quarter, 5, record levels of household debt, 6, consumer confidence at a 4-year low, 7, business confidence well below average, and 8, sluggish productivity growth. D, the International Monetary Fund has called on countries, including Australia, to provide fiscal support, saying monetary policy cannot be the only game in town and should be coupled with fiscal support where fiscal space is available. And E, the government has no plan to address Australia's floundering economy and continues to ignore calls from the Reserve Bank of Australia and the IMF to provide fiscal support, including by investing in infrastructure. And 2, therefore calls on the Prime Minister to be straight with the Australian people about Australia's floundering economy and develop a plan to stimulate economic growth, including by bringing forward infrastructure investment across the nation, including in regional and rural Australia. Mr Speaker, this arrogant government isn't even prepared to have a debate.
The Leader of the House has the call.
I move that the member no longer be heard.
The Leader of the House has moved that the Leader of the Opposition be no further heard. All those of that opinion say aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 4 minutes. Lock the doors. Order. The question is the Leader of the Opposition be no further heard. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair, the noes to the left. I appoint the honourable members for Nichols and Gray tellers for the ayes, and the honourable members for Lawler and Werriwa tellers for the noes. Order. The result of the division is ayes 71, noes 65. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. Is the motion seconded? The member for Rankin.
Seconded. They've got no plan and no idea, Mr Speaker. The economy is floundering.
Seat. The Leader of the House.
Member no longer be heard.
The Leader of the House has moved the member for Rankin be no further heard. All those of that opinion say aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 1 minute. And I appoint the same tellers as the previous division. Members must remain in their seats unless they're leaving the chamber or did not vote in the previous division, or they're changing their votes, in which case they must report to the tellers. Lock the doors. Order. The question is that the member for Rankin be no further heard. Members must remain in their seats unless they're changing their vote or they did not vote in the previous division, in which case they must report to the tellers. Order. The result of the division is ayes 71, no 65. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. The question now is that the motion moved by the Leader of the Opposition be agreed to. The Leader of the House.
Be put.
Leader of the House has moved that the question be put. All those of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 1 minute. Again, appoint the same tellers as the previous division. Members must remain in their seats unless they are leaving the chamber, or they did not vote in the previous division, or they are changing their votes, in which case they must report to the tellers. Lock the doors. Members must remain in their seats unless they're changing their vote or did not vote in the previous division, in which case they must report to the tellers. Order. The result of the division is ayes 71, no 65. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. The question is that the motion moved by the Leader of the Opposition be agreed to. All those of that opinion say aye. The contrary, no. I think the noes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 1 minute, but the tellers will do a full count because members are crossing. Lock the doors. Hang on, I'll just start. The question is that the motion moved by the Leader of the House be agreed to. All those of that opinion, so the ayes will pass to the right of the chair, the noes to the left. I appoint the honourable members for Lawler and Werriwa tellers for the ayes, and the honourable members for Nichols and Gray teller for the noes. Order. The result of the division is ayes 62, noes 74. The question is therefore negatived.
People are being mean to you.
If members can resume their seats, please. We can No. Order. Members on both sides. The member for Stirling.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Could the PM explain the alternative policies to the government's stable and responsible approach to managing the nation's finances in the face of global economic uncertainty?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. And I agree with him that the government is taking a responsible approach. We are taking the stable approach. We are ensuring that the way we manage the nation's finances, Mr Speaker, are ensuring that we're able to address the very present needs that Australians need today, and that is to keep more of what they earn through lower taxes, which we have already legislated through Parliament, that we are investing, Mr Speaker, in the $100 billion pipeline of infrastructure projects that support the growth of our economy. Now, Mr Speaker, I'm asking about what the alternative approach is. And you have just heard, Mr Speaker, from the Leader of the Opposition that what Labor would do and what Labor would have us do is return to the failed and reckless spending of the Rudd-Swan government, Mr Speaker. What they think is the response to the circumstances that we face today, which they put in some strange alignment with the issues of the global financial crisis and bird flu and any number of things, Mr Speaker.
The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order. The Leader of the Opposition, Prime Minister needs to resume his seat. No, the Prime Minister needs to resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. It goes to relevance.
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. That is no point of order. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Before I was interrupted, what I was saying, Mr Speaker—
Members on my left. Members on my left. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The reckless policies of the Labor Party under the Rudd-Swan government, which saw billions upon billions upon billions wasted on overpriced school halls, on pink bats, where people died in bruised, Mr Speaker, as a result of the ill-considered, rushed and reckless spending policies of the Labor Party. The thing about the Labor Party, Mr Speaker, is they never learn from their mistakes. They never learned from the mistakes of their fiscal recklessness that plunged the government's budget back into deficit and kept it there, and that's the reason. They were 6 years in government and they didn't deliver one surplus despite inheriting one, Mr Speaker. And our government, having inherited deficits, will deliver the first surplus in 12 years, Mr Speaker, because we understand the importance of disciplined financial management. Our government will not return to the reckless spending of Rudd and Swan, Mr Speaker. We will never engage in the reckless spending because Labor will take any excuse to spend more of your money and take more of your money off you in order to indulge their habit for reckless spending. They never learn from their mistakes, Mr Speaker. We were elected to implement Liberal policies and national policies of stable and disciplined financial management, not to engage in the budget recklessness and the policies of panic and crisis of the Labor Party. The only budget they've ever seen is one they want to blow.
Has concluded. Thank the Prime Minister.